Have you ever found yourself snapping, withdrawing, or going into full lecture mode when things get tough? Today we're exploring where we go when we're pushed, and more importantly, how we can redirect that energy more positively. If you are caring for someone else, whether paid or unpaid, and no matter how many hours you do it, did you realise that you may be missing out on thousands of pounds of discounts for things that you may use every day? The Able to Care podcast is proud to be sponsored by the UK's #1 carers card. Started by two best friends who recognise that carers deserve better and are 100% committed to helping to change the lives of all carers and bringing them together as a strong community. Carers Card UK provides support, recognition and rewards. It offers reassurance by providing an ID card that helps access emergency information when needed, while also unlocking discounts, a wellbeing hub, a carers circle tool and a community through their app. All of this for less than the price of a box of chocolates a year. There are discounts on gym membership, days out, electrical goods, clothing and even glasses. Let others know you care while taking a little care of yourself with an ID card you can be proud of. Visit carerscarduk.co.uk/promo code/able to care today to order yours. Hello and welcome to the Able to Care podcast. On today's episode, we're going to be understanding why our default reactions sometimes lead us astray when it comes to difficult situations and managing behaviour we find challenging, and what happens when we're under stress and learning how to navigate that more effectively. So many of us have engaged or encountered behaviour that we've found challenging, whether at work or in our personal lives. And we sometimes go to these default states, especially when we're experiencing a level of stress ourselves. And it's normal, it happens to the best of us, but understanding it and growing in our self-awareness can help us improve and make steps towards changing our responses. So when we're experiencing high levels of stress, and we have to understand that somebody engaging a behavior that we find distressful or we find upsetting, sometimes our brain perceives that behavior of something that could be detrimental to our well-being or doesn't fit in with our narrative, or it's got an element of unpredictability to it. So because of that sometimes need to control for humans to feel safe, it sometimes causes us to feel this stress state. When we're feeling overwhelmed, we don't know how to manage it, we don't know how to cope. But that then triggers the automatic kind of sympathetic nervous system into our fight or flight responses. Or if it's not something we feel we can fight or flight, it can lead us into our freeze and fawn responses. But those emotional responses can lead us to interact in situations in a way that may not be the most adaptive. There may not be the best methodology to be able to de-escalate a situation and to better support the person that we're working with, or to improve outcomes for all parties involved. So there are 5 common responses that many of us go into when we're encountering behavior that we're finding really difficult. One is we withdraw. We kind of shut down from it. We avoid the confrontation. We walk away, throw our hands up in the air. Okay, we retreat emotionally and kind of shut down empathically completely. The impact on this can lead to nothing gets resolved. Nothing changes, nothing happens. We may think at the time, sometimes we think it's the right thing to do because we're feeling emotional. If I don't walk away, I'm going to lose my temper. If I don't walk away, I'm going to respond negatively. Or sometimes we even think it's a positive thing in so much as I need to walk away to show them that this doesn't affect me, or I need to walk away to not reinforce their behavior. The only problem is that can cause disconnection in the relationship. That shutting down of I don't want to talk to you anymore means that we're immediately disconnecting from each other in that circumstance. And okay, sometimes that's the right thing to do to allow both parties to re-regulate and things like that, but it all depends on how both parties perceive that. If it's a case of I've been rejected again by this person, then obviously that can be really detrimental. So I'm displaying distress and you've rejected me for it. And so those of you out there who are supporting individuals who experience trauma, abuse, neglect, abandonment, anything along those lines, that might perpetuate that cycle of, see, nobody can cope with me. I'm always bad. I always push people away. I'll never have anybody around to love me. So actually that can perpetuate negative cycles. One of the things when we're thinking about that is notice the early signs in yourself that you're feeling that urge to shut down, walk away. And even if you do it more temporarily rather than I'm just going to take a step away for a second, I just need to take a breath and then I'll come back and reconnect. Okay. But also practicing verbalizing your needs. I'm finding this really difficult and I just need to get myself calmer. Saying it out loud can sometimes help us to explain to the other person what's going on for us so they recognize that it's not a them thing, it's a you thing. Sometimes, even though it may be their behavior that's causing it, but it's you that's struggling to regulate, you that's struggling to cope with it. The next one is boundary enforcement. And boundary enforcement is where we become excessively rigid. Rules are rules. The problem is boundaries shouldn't be barriers. We're going to do other episodes around looking at boundaries within behavior management and relationships because they are so important. So boundaries are important, but sometimes we go into boundary overdrive. That suddenly we just get fixed on nothing but the boundary and we forget about the person that we're supporting. We focus so much on the behavior or the rule, we forget about empathically connecting with the individual themselves. It can be necessary, but may come across as really inflexible. There's also this over control that it just becomes resentment as well. So let's say, for instance, I'm 5 minutes home late on curfew, for instance, in a situation with a parent, and suddenly it's a case of, right, that's it, you're never going out again. All that tends to cause is kind of resentment. They're just a case of, well, that's not fair. It's because the taxi broke down. You haven't even listened to my side of the story or anything like that. And that inflexibility can just cause disconnect in the relationship again. And actually can lead to then further, well, because you're so firm with your boundaries, I need to push harder to try and get past them because I feel unhappy or I lose autonomy in my side of the relationship because you've gone into boundary overdrive. So one of the things when you're thinking, if you feel yourself going into that boundary overdrive and you wanted to go, well, rules are rules, always self-evaluate. If you're getting in that mindset of should, shouldn't, must not, then remember that sometimes are based on a value structure and a belief system rather than necessarily facts of what's in the best interest for the relationship and for the individual that we're supporting. So check, is this just about control or is it a genuine need for structure? Is it genuinely about well-being, safety and best interests? Because if you're falling into the trap about boundary enforcement because it's a case of I must be in control, well, that's you in your fight mode. That's an emotional state. I must win. Well, straight away, if we're into relationships of a win-lose scenario, that's not necessarily a healthy connection and a healthy relationship. The next example after boundary enforcement is what's called consequence overdrive. So excessive punishment or ultimatums. If you don't do this, I'm going to do this. And I know I have done this and made this mistake of, I never claimed to be perfect in any way. So I remember when my son was younger, kind of, right, that's it, go on the Xbox for the rest of the week, kind of throw out excessive punishment. Sometimes it wasn't related to the crime. Sometimes it was excessive. And sometimes immediately when I made it, it's a case of, the week's a really long time. What am I going to do with him for a week? Okay, a day, an hour, 5 minutes. Because in that moment, I made it emotionally. It was a reaction rather than a response. And the problem is that can cause a sense of injustice in the other person. If they recognize it doesn't feel fair, doesn't feel right, the crime doesn't fit the punishment, it actually can cause damage to the relationship. But also you're sometimes perceived to be weak because it's recognized that it's an emotional response. You can't control your emotions, but you're telling me how I should control mine. We have to lead by role modeling in these situations. It can erode trust. It can escalate a situation unnecessarily. And for many of you working more in a care environment, for instance, this can actually mean that we're getting into the realms of a potential emotional abuse or safeguarding issue. Because did we have a right to put in that consequence or that punishment or that ultimatum? Also, if we give that huge ultimatum and then we're not actually able to follow it through, we're actually undermining ourselves. But my big thing is, I don't trust people who threaten me. So straight away, that can damage connection and trust as a result of that. So my tip for this is pause. With all of these, it's just take the breath, respond rather than react. Never throw a consequence when you're in that emotional state. It's like you should never go shopping when you're hungry because you'll buy stuff you shouldn't buy. Recognizing, maybe I should eat before I go shopping to make sure that I'm working from a rational rather than from an emotional point of view. It's exactly the same thing when you're responding with consequences. Before there is a consequence or any kind of outcome, we need to make sure that we're stepping back, taking a breath, and then looking at it as a response from the reaction. And then there's the consequence. Is it short, immediate, relevant? And then it should be forgotten. The next example is giving up on structure completely. And I've seen many parents, caregivers doing this, where it's kind of them throwing their hands up and, oh, do what you want. This is where suddenly we're trying to enforce some kind of boundary or rule, or we're trying to manage a situation, but we immediately just give up on structure completely. We abandon the rules, allowing chaos just for the sake of peace, just because we don't know what else to do. All of these are often sometimes short-term solutions. That's reduced my stress, but it leads to the long-term problem that, we didn't manage it, we've undermined ourselves, and it can lead to inconsistency and confusion. Because straight away, you're saying that there's a rule there, a boundary there, that this is or isn't an inappropriate behavior. And then the next minute, you're throwing your arms up in the air and saying, well, it doesn't matter anymore. This can be confusing for some individuals. That inconsistency can lead to a sense of unpredictability, which can lead to anxiety. So when we're working on that kind of principle, again, it's self-regulating. How are you managing? How are you coping? You're going into a submissive kind of a fawn response of just, oh, do what you want. There's an element of other aspects of emotional content in there. There's an ambivalence to it that you want to control it, but you just feel it's a loss of what you should do. The important thing is always reflect on what are the core values and the most important things for well-being for all parties. If you're giving up on the rules because actually that rule isn't appropriate, then we should be communicating that, and again, communicating it through a response rather than through a reaction. But allowing flexibility can sometimes be the right thing. But under control and over control are two opposite sides of a negative coin. If there's a rule in place and I go over control, that's it, rules are rules. But on the other side, I just go, oh, do what you want and ignore it completely. Well, then we're undermining an entire system. And unfortunately, for many organizations where, let's say it isn't just a parenting household, it's more a care-based environment where there's multiple staff. If there is systems in place and positive behavioral support plans in place to ensure the well-being and the safety of all individuals there's usually a reason that those boundaries, rules are in place. And suddenly if you get certain staff who just give up on that structure because they don't know how to cope, they don't know how to manage it, and this isn't down to them not being good enough, it's a case of they're learning, they're making mistakes, but they need some support. But that can undermine the entire system. If we're recognizing that a certain behavior potentially has a function, it seems to get an outcome, and then we're trying to adjust that to help them learn a more adaptive, a more beneficial way of meeting that need for themselves, but then some staff aren't allowing that learning to occur, then straight away it's giving mixed messages to the individual. It can cause confusion, and it actually impacts on the outcomes and learning that's involved. The last one out of the 5 is lecture mode. And I know I've been guilty of this at times, where sometimes we want to become the teacher. We become over-explainers. We start talking at somebody rather than with somebody. We become the persecutor. The problem is with the lecture mode, and I've seen it with my lad when he was younger, I could just sometimes see his eyes glaze over and he just wasn't listening to me anymore. But that would make me more angry rather than recognize that this isn't working, because I wanted him to listen. I wanted him to kind of take on board. It was I know best, so you need to listen. The problem is that doesn't allow for autonomy. That doesn't allow for his personal identity, for his point of view to come across. And people are far more likely to engage in rules or follow rules or work towards their best interest if they're part of the choice in that happening, that they're collaborative and they've got autonomy in motivation towards that particular thing, but also there's the right fit for them within their circumstance. So the over-explaining sometimes feels like, well, they need to learn, they need to know, I need to tell them also this information, but especially sometimes the way we're presenting it or the moment we're presenting it. Because in a heightened state of arousal, as many of you will know from other episodes, the brain doesn't process information in that same way. We're appealing to the logical part of the brain when it's the emotional part of the brain that's taken over. So we're wasting our breath. But it can feel sometimes validating. I'm in control, I'm talking, you're having to listen to me. But again, this can cause disconnection. It leads to disengagement rather than resolution. So when we're thinking, depending on where a person is in their escalation cycle, when it comes to kind of lecture mode, we need to use concise, minimal communication, but meaningful communication. Connection before correction every time as well. But because now may not be the time to appeal to the logical part of the brain and explore what can we do differently, how can we manage this, what would work for both of us, let's negotiate and collaborate on an ideal outcome for all. Your 5 different responses and their impact. So we've got withdrawal, we've got boundary enforcement, we've got consequence overdrive, we've got giving up on structure completely, and then we've got lecture mode. These are all the states we sometimes disappear into and go into autopilot on when we're dealing with difficult behavior or behavior that we're finding challenging, or we're trying to confront a rule or whatever it is. The important thing is notice those patterns. Which one do you go into? Which one do you throw out there or you end up reacting with at times? Is it more than one? Is it just one of them every time? And if you notice it, then you can start to do something about it. So a few things you can do post-incident. Always reflect. Always look back, and not just about what they did wrong, but also how did you cope with it? How did you feel in the moment? All the tactics that we should be using to help somebody else to better navigate life should be things we're using to navigate life. We can't have expectations on other people that we don't have on ourselves. So if we're going through something like the 6-stage target model, for instance, of identifying and understanding and then proactively planning, we should be doing the same about ourselves. If I've reacted to a situation, well, this is a behavior that they would have found challenging from me. So I need to identify it. I need to understand why. Where did that come from? What was I feeling in that moment in time? So we can do things like we would within an organization. If we're looking at behavior management, we're incident reporting. Well, do it for yourself. Journaling. Okay. Reflecting on your responses or reactions in certain situations, but also practicing the pause, learning to take a breath. When you're engaging with a situation, learn to take a step back, and even if it's just one big deep breath, just to allow your brain to reactivate in the rational way rather than the emotional way. Taking a step back from a situation and just going, right, am I in the right emotional state? Am I angry? Am I upset? So should I be calm before I manage this situation or communicate or set any consequences, etc.? We also need to reframe the situation, shift our perspective. Is this about control? Are you looking to control the other person? Or are you looking to work with them to improve their outcomes, their quality of life, their best interests? And my encouragement would be that we should always be looking to collaborate. Okay? Even with our own children, the instinct is I need to control, but one day you're not going to be there to control them anymore. They're going to be on their own. So isn't it better that they kind of helped to figure out and navigate them life for themselves? It's like if you always just cook for them or tell them what to do, well, then how are they going to cook for themselves when they go into the real world? Exactly the same when it comes to navigating emotions and navigating behavior and navigating rules and things like that. Helping them to understand why this is beneficial to them rather than detrimental to them. Working together as a team. And wouldn't it be nicer for any parents out there, foster parents out there, any caregivers out there, whether it be working with somebody with mental health or learning disabilities or whoever it is, working together for the best interests rather than against. Because that's usually the case. We're both interested in the best interest of the individual. We both want the best for them, but sometimes it can feel like we're in confrontation rather than collaboration. And finding balance, mixing structure with understanding. Boundaries are important, of course they are. But we also need to understand and put ourselves in the point of view of the other person. Why are they finding this boundary hard? Why are they finding it difficult? Do they not see the benefits? Do they not understand it? Are they just feeling they need to test it because they need to have some level of autonomy and control? These are all things that a phrase that many of you heard, and again, I never made it up, but learning to become a better detective than judge is one of the most powerful tools we have for self-regulating and building self-awareness. Okay, so what do you do when you're pushed? Where do you go emotionally? Do you recognize any of those particular traits in yourself of how you react in certain situations? Is there something that you could do differently? Is there that pause that you could take before you take any action? I encourage you strongly to reflect on everything I've covered on today's session. But if you found anything that I've talked about interesting or engaging, then please like, comment, and share. Otherwise, Thank you very much and good luck managing the challenges you have out there. Let me ask you a question. Do you ever find the pressures of supporting, teaching, or caring for someone else overwhelming and wish you had access to more support and information? The Able to Care podcast, in connection with Able Training, has created the ablehub.uk, where for less than the price of a coffee a week, you can access exclusive podcast content, resources, events, and over 45 certified online courses, covering topics like self-care, understanding dementia, neurodiversity, first aid, conflict management, financial advice, and so much more, with new content and courses being added each month. We are so confident that you will benefit from the Able Hub that we are offering 14 days access completely free of charge. No contract, cancel anytime. Become part of the ablehub.uk community and gain the support, knowledge, and resources you deserve. Don't struggle alone. Be able. Find the link in the description.